Welcome. We're really glad that you're here today. My name's Hannah, and I am the Western Massachusetts Regenerative Food Systems Coordinator here at NOFA Mass. You're attending Chestnut Agroforestry, update on practices and soil health changes here with Jono. And we're really excited to have you today. Jono has 30 years of professional experience in permaculture, site planning, agroforestry, conservation, and restoration. He's a founding partner of the Permaculture Association and of the Northeast Regenerative Design Group. He holds a Master of Arts in Landscape Design from the Conway School and a Bachelor's of Science in Forest Biology from S.U.N.Y College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Jono teaches widely and is the author of the Permaculture Promise. And we're really excited to have him here today. Before we jump in, I just have a couple of details to share with you all. NOFA Mass is strengthening our commitment to racial equity and justice by examining whiteness and dismantling systems of white supremacy that are part of many dominant systems, including our agricultural and food systems. We want to honor the Indigenous land stewards who are the original occupants of the land that we're currently living, farming, and residing. Paul will drop a link in the chat for us here where you can find the area you farm and live on and identify the original stewards of these lands. And thank you for joining us in this paradigm shift of recognition and appreciation. We also want to call on everyone, especially and co-conspirators, to action on a few items and assist BIPOC-led organizations. These actions are listed on the slide. Also, 2 events are taking place for Spanish speakers and for BIPOC members, which we're really excited to be able to host. Now for some Zoom norms. We'll make every effort to get your questions you have answered during the first workshop. Feel free to use the chat feature to comment and ask questions during the workshop, and we'll pose your question to the presenter throughout the session. Any clarifications or whatever it might be, Jono is really open to sharing information. And we'll try to find some time at the end for you to go off mute and ask your questions live. To speak, you will simply click on the microphone icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're having trouble, feel free to write in the chat and we can help you with that. But when you're done, you can go ahead and remute yourself to avoid any background noise or cross audio. And then also, which is really exciting, we can save the chat. To the right of the chat box, there are 3 dots with extra actions. You click them and select Save Chat, and it will download the chat to your computer. So if people are dropping links and sharing resources and things like that, you're welcome to save those. And it will probably show up in your downloads file. And please note that this session is being recorded. And we have a number of sponsors. A special thanks to them who help make our conference possible. We encourage you to purchase from them when you and let them know that you're appreciative of NOFA Mass and vice versa. So these here are gold sponsors. We also have our silver sponsors, so thanks to them too. Also, we have an online auction, some really incredible items to bid on. Paul will also drop the link in the chat for that. We have the Rally Up Winter Auction, or you can send a text, you can text NOFA to the number at the bottom of the screen, and you can see the lineup that way. We also have some virtual vendors where there's a lot of great information and some generous discount codes for conference attendees. Most importantly, we want to thank you. Thank you for spending the weekend with us, and especially to our NOFA members who make our education and advocacy work possible. At this point, I'll go ahead and turn it on over to Jono. Let me stop my share screen.
Yeah.
There we go. All right, mic is yours.
All right, and I will get my slides up. Thank you all for being here. I'm really glad to be talking today about Big River Chestnuts and the work that we've been doing there for the last number of years. It's been a lot of fun and a lot of challenges and a lot of learning. So I'm glad to share with you all that. And as Hannah said, there's time for questions along the way. Pop them into the chat, or we can have some discussion time at the end as well. And so a little bit of context about Big River Chestnuts. So we're in Sunderland, Mass. The road you can see on the right there is Route 47. We're right along the Connecticut River on the floodplain terrace. It's rich, fertile bottomland. There's a riparian buffer along the river and along a stream on the east side of the property. And we're doing a number of different kinds of practices, perennial cropping practices that we'll get into, namely alley cropping and then a silvopasture, which is a rotational chicken grazing. So we've been going for 4 years. And this is our 4th growing season in 2021, really early in establishment, just things are really just kind of kicking in. We've planted about 350 chestnut trees. So these are Chinese chestnuts and Chinese hybrids with mostly Chinese genetics. And then in the alleys between the rows of chestnut trees, there's some small fruit. So namely elderberry, aronia, also some black currant as well right now. And then in the farm area, there's also some other elements. Like in the foreground here, you can see this unmowed, lush verdant area is a wet meadow. It's a bit of a wetter area of the field. And so we've been planting some other things like pawpaws and basket willow and more elderberry, and then also just letting the super pollinator plants get established. There's also a hedgerow to the north. And so we'll take a look at that as well here. Okay, so the soils, which we're going to be talking about a good amount today, are, as I said, we're in the floodplain of the Connecticut River. So there are these deep bottomland soils, which are primarily silt. It's about 80%, 75 to 80% silt, with just a little bit of clay and sand mixed in as well. And there's been tillage here historically going back generations, annual production primarily. And so a lot of the soil challenges that we're facing are because of that historic tillage in these fairly heavy soils. So we've got low organic matter, there's compaction, primarily at the 3 to 15 inches. And so that has led to some really hard drainage conditions, challenges around that, challenges to soil biology, which is very minimal. And then there are mineral imbalances. So these are the kind of things that we're looking to work with as we get established, get things going. And then the grant funds that we have were to really investigate this and try and get a better picture. So a little bit about the small fruit, just some visuals on the elderberry on the left there. And that's our colleague, Kim Almeida, harvesting flowers for her herbal business. And then on the right, is aronia, which we're growing as a fruit, whole fruit, and bags of aronia that we're selling there on the bottom, just whole frozen berries for people to use in smoothies and baking. And we've got a number of other minor crops that we're growing. So in the center there, by my son Forrest, is goji that's on the bush, and we're also growing pawpaws and persimmons, hazelnuts, heart nuts, a lot of other crops just to trial, experiment, see how they do. They might become a larger part of our system at some point in the future, but for now they're just minor crops. All right, so zoom out just a bit for a look at chestnuts. Why chestnuts? What's happening with chestnuts? And really, right now, we're seeing them emerge as a regional crop. They're emerging across the whole country, or in the U.S. On the left is Russell Wallach with some of the burrs that are ripening on a young tree. On the bottom left is a tree that's in flower, and you can kind of see a sort of small roundish shape. So it's a small tree, though it can get larger. On the right is a tree that's probably 50 feet tall, but that's the extent of it. 50 to 60 feet is a huge Chinese chestnut. So it's generally a smaller tree that's suitable for agriculture kinds of settings. And as far as the commercial and market part of it, some information about where we stand. The U.S. is the only country right now that can grow chestnuts that doesn't have a commercial chestnut industry, or we barely have a chestnut industry. We import hundreds of $millions worth of nuts annually, and produce only a very small percentage of our own consumption in the U.S. And we could talk about the quality of nuts that then get imported and how they're treated, and there's challenges there. So there's some thousands of acres of chestnuts that are growing in the U.S., and I'd say that there's definitely hundreds of acres being planted a year right now. I don't even know, maybe thousands at this point. So there's a lot of excitement around this. And it's been estimated that it would take about 10,000 acres of producing chestnuts orchards to supply what we're importing. So we're a long way from growing what we consume right now. And in Massachusetts in particular, there's possibly less than 20 acres. Definitely, there could be a little bit more than that at this point, but certainly not very much more. And the 7 acres that I'm growing on are part of that. So where do chestnuts want to grow? They're hardy to our climate zones 4 through 8. They can handle these hot summers. They can even handle the dry summers. Wet is maybe a little more of a challenge. They need well-drained soils. They need acidic soil conditions, 5.5 to 6.5. They can handle, slope, flat to moderately steep, but actually they're actually suitable even getting into some steeper sloped areas, and can do well on hillsides in some of the Northeast conditions, and could be a really good crop for challenging areas, growing areas. And they need full sun. And of course, you need to have good access to get to the trees for harvest. And so what we're looking at with chestnuts is being able to grow them as part of these integrated systems, and particularly agroforestry systems where we're integrating a tree crop such as chestnuts with other crops, with livestock. We're having these integrations to get benefits, environmental benefits and economic benefits and social benefits, diversification of farms, the ability to buffer extreme conditions and to be able to have multiple different crops that can handle different conditions depending on whether we have a very wet year or a very dry year. So some examples of that on the left is fruit trees in the rows and then nursery production in the alleys. So being able to get a crop, a perennial crop, and then also having a business. And on the right, fruit and nut trees growing in the rows, and then just annual grain production or some other kind of annual grain. So, so there's a lot of flexibility and adaptability. Another kind of system with a tree crop like this is silvopasture, where you're having grazing in between. And this is a project at UMass in Amherst, developing and sort of learning more about how to graze sheep in the alleys of an establishing chestnut orchard. And so there's a lot of interest, a lot of excitement. This is from an article on the bottom left. There's an article in the local paper about the growing interest in this and the experimentation that's happening. And so another facet of this is we've been developing the production and making more connections and seeing a lot of increased interest is I've been working with Gregory Ormsby Morey and his business Forestopia, which you should definitely look at, where he's bringing in tree crops, agroforestry derived crops, and helping to develop markets for these different crops. And we we bought in chestnuts from a number of different growers around the Northeast, and we sold them through a market. We did some fresh roasting and selling fresh nuts and roasted nuts at a market at Big River Chestnuts. And you can see on the left in the cooler, there's the bags of chestnuts. We had about 800 pounds to sell. We saw a lot of interest, a lot of excitement. It was really quite fun and working on a lot of systems for processing the nuts and getting the word out. So we're looking at the potential for the farm stand here at Big River Chestnuts to be a hub where some processing equipment could be, where people could, growers, farmers that want to get crops established but need some assurance of both market and also the access to processing equipment, would have a place to go to and have some share in that and some ability to have some co-ownership. So we're looking at some different models and excited to start developing that in the next few years. All right, so the one of the aspects of this project of the grant that we'll be talking about in a moment is that we are using these specific regenerative agriculture practices, a whole suite of them, something like a toolbox, and then we're tracking how the soil conditions have improved or changed over time, and we're doing these different practices in different kind of ways over the years, and trying to understand how they might be affecting or improving the conditions of the soil. And they start with the perennial crops, the fact that we're growing a tree crop plus the small fruit. We're getting that permanent rooting and deep rooting. We're primarily no-till, and we do vegetation management, subsoiling, fertigation, mineral amendments, biological inoculation, cover crops, and the rotational grazing. And so we're going to take a look at those, have some visuals of each of those to look over. But first, just a little bit about the layout of the field, so you can get a better sense of that. Again, the rows going north and south, and the black lines are the tree rows. And they're spacing is generally 40 feet apart between the tree rows. And then in between those in orange is the small fruit, and two rows of small fruit at about 10 to 12 feet space between the two small fruit rows. And that allows for a little bit of access in between as they grow in. And you can see this center alley with the elderberry flowers should be able to just barely make out the flowers there. So that that alley is in elderberry. The alley to the left, the two orange rows, is in black currant. And then the alley to the right there is the aronia just getting established. And then what we're doing is over time propagating from these blocks of small fruit and establishing them over to the next one. So there's aronia over to the right in this photo, and then below the photo in the foreground are additional blocks of elderberries that we're getting established. So sort of slowly moving out and expanding those over time. And then in the other part of the field, looking ahead, you see where the black arrows are, there's some tighter spacing of the chestnuts, and they're at 20-foot spacing there. And so we've got a few different chestnut spacings. The reason for the tighter spacing is that it will allow the trees to come into bearing sooner because there's more pollen, and they're closer to each other. When there's less pollen in the field, they're closer to each other and able to set nuts in the burrs. Then they will need to be thinned out. 20 by 20 is just very, very close spacing, and they're going to end up being 40 to 50 foot diameter. And so there'll be a couple rounds of thinning somewhere around probably 15 years, and then another round later on. And then we're also working with Eric Toensmeyer, who's helping us. He's doing a lot of work right now with Interlace Agroforestry, exploring the nuances and the layout and spacing considerations for alley cropping. And so this is just some additional, preliminary information when he was looking at the size of the chestnuts and the spacings that we have. And for the 20 by 40 spacing, he's looking at some different indexes, predicting how much sun will be available. And so he's looking at in the opening index, sunny alleys throughout the life of the trees, but the tree densities that the chestnuts have, we would have sunny alleys until the trees are 35 feet high. So somewhere around 12 years or so, we're going to really start to have limitations in the sun in the alley. So there's this successional pattern to this planting where the alley plantings, these shrubs, the elderberry, aronia, the black currant, will be there for the first 10 to 15, maybe 18 years. And then we would be segueing over into a shade zone unless we decide to do some thinning of the trees. All right, so we'll go on. Just a little bit of logistical pieces about protection of the trees. The two methods that we've used for deer protection have been the tree tubes on the left, and we're using the Planter brand, which is a pretty nice high-end brand of tree tube, has been very effective. That one is 5 feet tall, and you can see the woody wood chip mulch around the base there. And then the other one on the right is a welded wire cage of 2 to 3 foot diameter, a single T-post, because we're not really having a lot of deer pushing up against the wire cage. Again, 5 feet tall, and it's got some vole protection down below. So hardware cloth in this case. We're also using some other materials vole protection that go into the ground. And that has been one of the larger issues in this field in particular, where it's situated in the valley, the Connecticut River Valley. There isn't a lot of deer pressure, but there is a lot of vole pressure and a lot of vole activity. And so we found that actually is a bigger issue, a much bigger issue than the deer protection. Okay, we're going to try this out. So one of the practices that we've been doing is in this field that it was fallow for a period of time before we took over. And so it has grown up. There's a lot of wild, intense growth, including, you can see here, box elder and a lot of sumac. Oops. All right. Hopefully you can still hear me. So here we are going through and mowing that down, letting it grow up, letting that shrub growth grow up and get established, and then coming through with the mower and chopping it up. And we're basically doing mulch in place. We're getting this woody mulch on the ground. So it's just like a coppice in place. We're calling this a short rotation coppice, where we're mowing every once a year, once every 2 years, and in some cases every 3 years. So you can sort of see how this is working. So it's letting get a little bit wild. I'm going to try and pause it right there. So you could see in the chicken yard where there's some young growth, a lot of young sumac. So it's very soft and pretty easy to mow through when it's at that stage. And it's allowing that to grow up and be cover for the chickens, allowing it to deep root and push more organic matter down into the soil, because that's really our limitation right now, is the lack of organic matter and the heaviness of the soil. And so having that deep rooting of these woody plants, the box elder, the sumac, and the herbaceous plants like goldenrod and thistle. And so then coming through and chopping that up is we're seeing that as a real benefit to the soil. All right, another method of dealing with this heavy soil conditions is the use of the subsoiler. So even though we're no-till, we are doing a little bit of subsoiling and a little bit of disking. So it's, I guess, minimum till. I'm not really a purist in any kind of way. We're using the subsoil as a way to just break into that compacted soil layer. You can see here on the back of the tractor, it's a single shank, pretty small little subsoiler. And this is about all that my little tractor can pull. And it can get down about a foot with this one single shank, but then is going to go pretty slow. So let me see if I can start this. You can see how slow the tractor is going to be able to pull it through, getting really only maybe 10 to 12 inches down. And it's a pretty heavy duty, it's a pretty hard job. And I will say that this pretty inexpensive subsoiler already broke, already snapped in a couple places, and we had to re-weld it even just within the first year of use. And we ended up, you can see how slow it's operating. We ended up having a neighbor who came by, who was subsoiling their field with a much larger tractor and was able to go much deeper, came through and did part of our field, and it made a pretty big difference. So this is really nice, like fast, quick change that we've done twice in the 4 years so far, 2 rounds of subsoiling to kind of try and break that compacted layer, allow the rooting, allow the water infiltration in the rooting, and then we're doing some of the other practices like the, oops, here we go. This is our fertigation and foliar feeding system, where we're spraying some of these amendments, mineral amendments and biological amendments from a tank being pulled by a truck or the tractor through the field. We can do this with one person who's in the cab, who has the hose coming up, and we're just spraying right onto the trees, or with two people there on the bottom, the second person walking along and spraying the trees. And so we've been using a variety of different mixes depending on the soil test, but some of them are just inoculants meant to just stimulate the soil and feed the soil biology, such as fish hydrolysate, kelp, molasses. Other materials that we're adding are amendments that are helping to fill deficiencies that are in the soil, with the calcium of gypsum, borax and zinc, and just other minerals. And so we're finding this to be pretty effective to be able to target the mineral amendments right at the trees, and the foliar feeds. If we can get it on the cool mornings and coat the leaves, then we think we're getting pretty good uptake with the trees, and seeing some good growth on the trees, and good growth in the field as well. As part of the fertigation, the inoculation, we are bringing in different kinds of biological inoculants. On the right there, we're using some of the biological inoculants as a root dip for the planting zone. So just getting it right into the rooting zone of the tree as it's getting established. And it's sort of our best chance at getting any kind of mycorrhizal symbiosis happening in the root zone right from the start. And we've been collecting puffballs from both the field here and adjacent woodlands and other woodlands. Some puffballs are mycorrhizal associates, so that's what we generally want. The chestnuts are oak family, so they're related to oak trees, and we can bring in some of those. So we're using both inoculants from the forest soils and also some store-bought inoculants as well. Another practice that we're using are cover crops. So we're looking at diversity here, bringing in a lot of different kinds of cover crops, a mix of both perennial and annuals. We're looking at over time diversifying or focusing more on perennial cover crops, where we would have the orchard floor, the ground layer pretty much no more disturbance, where for sowing of cover crops, we've been doing a light disking to break up that ground, and then another pass over to get the good soil contact and get the cover crops established. So in this coming year, in the next couple of years, we'll be transitioning to just primarily perennial cover crops. And so the diverse mix that you can see there has both perennials and some annuals. We've got some deep rooters in there. We're really trying to break up that soil with the dyke radish, chicory, the yellow sweet clover. A lot of those are very deep rooters. A number of them are nitrogen fixers. So we're wanting to have that diversity and feed the diversity of the biology. As the biology is increasing in the soil, have the diversity of the soil of the cover crop mix as well to go along with that. All right, so one aspect of the our work on the farm is integrating the chickens into the rotation, and the way we defined it for the layout is the north side, which is the far side of this picture, is the alley cropping with small fruits, and then the south side, where you can see the livestock, the chickens in there, is the closer spaced trees and where the chickens are being run through. And I've been working with an associate, Martin Anderton, who for the last several years has been running chickens through the field, primarily red rangers, and they're coming in as chicks and being raised in the brooder in that small pen you can see there, the small greenhouse just ahead there. And then they go out after in weeks 5 to 8 onto the range and into these fenced areas with the poly netting and the protected covers over the top. And then they're rotated through the fields, moved through the fields successively within the polynet areas. So you can see here 2 different areas laid out with the netting, and inside those fenced zones are the shelters for the chickens, and the shelters are for the chickens to be able to get out of the elements. That's where their feeding happens. They have some protection from aerial predators there, and then they move down, and then that shelter is moved every several days to once a week. And you can kind of see here where the shelter has been moved down towards us in the picture, and behind it is slightly browner where they've been manuring and scratching and tilling up that soil and that ground and opening it up. And then as they move ahead, they've got new grass, new forage to get onto. And definitely seeing some really intense lush growth happening from where the chickens have been. We're definitely adding a lot of manure in there. There's another view of the shelters, in this case 3 shelters inside, moving successfully down the rows there. And the picture on the left is, you can get a sense of the numbers, large numbers. They're in flocks of 300. So enough to be able to really go through, till up the area, manure down an area, and then get moved ahead onto into the next space. All right, so just a shout out to the abundance and the growth that we've seen in the field. This isn't the best photo. You can just barely see the purple of the vetch and some of the cover crops, and just the verdant life that's there. Incredible amount of pollinators, incredible support for, there's a lot of monarchs in there, a lot of bees, just astounding. On the left there, that's Moo Butler helping out with the scything, and next to her is a wild lettuce that's somewhere between 12 and 14 feet tall. Just astounding growth, and a lot of wildlife, including some wildlife that we don't necessarily want. So there's our puppy on the right, who has shown herself to be pretty good at vole hunting, and she's got a vole in her mouth that might be a little hard to see there. Of course, not really putting a dent in the vole population, but it's what we're finding is that if we can find the balance of opening up the space enough to allow predators to come in, the foxes, the coyotes, the ravens and crows. We've had great blue herons come into the field to do hunting of the voles and rodents. Then we're just creating a system that supports a lot of life in it, in addition to the crops that we want to grow. And that's really our goal. All right, so just to switch gears from the practices that we've been using and the activities in the field and the crops, and to look at the monitoring that we're doing on the soil conditions. And the grant that we got from SARES to help fund the testing, the time it takes to monitor, all some extra support from people like Eric Tonesmeyer to come in, and the time it's taking to look at this. And again, the soil challenges, the organic matter, the compaction that we have, which is causing problems with drainage, the low soil biology activity, and also the mineral imbalances. And so the testing that we've been doing are these 3 different protocols, and it's been very interesting. We've had been doing the NOFA soil health assessment, originally called the soil health proxy testing, and that is both a field and a lab series of tests. We've been doing the Cornell CASH protocol, which is the comprehensive assessment of soil health. That one, except for the compaction or the penetrometer readings, is primarily lab based, so sending samples in. And then for soil fertility, we're sending samples into Logan Labs and getting results back on that. And so you can use this link and check in on the progress of the and get more of the data. I'll show a little bit here, but there'll be more data available through the SARE website. And so we'll look a little bit more at the testing protocol. So here's Carol Roselle, who's worked with us for a number of years doing the soil health assessment through NOFA Mass. She's now with American Farmland Trust, and Ruben Perilla has been helping us out. So shout out to the NOFA Mass Soil Health Assessment program, and highly advise folks to take a look at that and think about bringing Ruben in to look at your fields. So the tests are pretty wide ranging, from the surface biology, earthworm count and biopores, soil texture, visual aggregation assessment, soil hardness, looking at water infiltration, looking at the bulk density. Slake test is a test to look at how strongly the aggregates of the soil hold together, and active carbon. And Carol on the left there is looking at the aggregation of the soil. It's a pretty blocky, heavy soil because of the silt. And so she's exploring there in that photo what's happening with that blockiness, how well the rooting is coming down, how's the rooting going. And in the center there is a little visual of a plant with the soil holding on around the edges of the roots, and giving a sense of that there's some biology around the roots is starting to develop and starting to improve, and it's sticking to the roots and improving the conditions in the soil through that rooting that's happening. And so some of the information is coming through a visual assessment and the observations of what's happening, and some of it's coming through these tests that are happening either in the field or in the lab. And so the second test I mentioned is the Cornell CASH, the Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health. And this is the summary sheet from the tests. This is our test from this last summer. And the summary that you could see the tests at either as a physical property, a biological property, or chemical property. The value is the actual number that was gotten from looking at the soil, and then each value is rated on a 1 to 100 scale, and either red, it's in a really challenged, or going up to green for good. And you can see a lot of red here. There's a lot of places where the soil is really challenged, as I've been mentioning. The aggregate stability is very low. The organic matter is very low. Still low in the soil protein and soil respiration, which is an indicator of the biology, and the respiration of the soil is a indicator of how active that biology is. And so the overall score is 52, is really down kind of in the middle, which is okay. And I'll show you here. We'll just also point out here the texture. So the silt loam texture, as I said before, 74% silt. So it's a primarily silt with some clay and some sand as well. And now we're starting to get some data from over the number of years that we've been doing this. So here's the cache testing for 2 different locations, north and south, for the last 3 years. And what we're seeing here, it's a little bit hard to read, is that there hasn't been a lot of movement. So a lot of the numbers going across from 2019 on the left, 2020 in the middle, coming up to 2021, have not shifted a lot, or they've changed. Even here, the surface hardness, which is the compaction measure, which was pretty good in 2019. We came up with some lower numbers, more compacted numbers in the last couple of years. Some of the numbers have gotten better, and for instance, some of the potassium, some of the extractable phosphorus has stayed very good. The pH is still really good, and the active carbon has showed better in 2020, and then poorer in 2021. So the picture here is one of, for the cache testing, pretty variable, pretty back and forth, and not seeing any strong trends one way or the other. Though, as we'll see, there are some trends in some of the other testing. So we have also been looking closely at the soil biology in these the cache test and the NOFA mass test, as well as bringing in Monique Bosch from the Wiggle Room in Connecticut. She's really amazing and has come out and done some testing and looking in the microscope at the soil biology activity. And we are seeing some great signs of increased fungal activity, increased soil biology. This view through the microscope down below, that is showing some good soil aggregation, the clumpiness of the soil with the organic materials binding together with the mineral particles. And then there's also a good number of mycorrhizal pieces within that. So there's some good signs that the biology is starting to kick in and improve with the materials that we've been adding, the practices that we've been using, and so that's pretty hopeful. And so I'm going to summarize here and wrap it up, and then we'll have some time for questions. We're seeing some areas of soil improvement. There is some improvement in some lowered compaction in some of the layers just below the very topsoil. Some lowering in the bulk density. Some improvement in aggregate stability. Some improvement in the soil biology. We think that that and the effects of the rooting are helping with the aggregate stability. Active carbon has definitely gone from poor to excellent. So we're increasing the amounts of carbon, increases in earthworm activity and fungal activity. So overall, this is, big picture, what we've seen is that the trees and the small fruit are doing great. The getting good growth on the plants. There's harvests that are starting to come in. There's fruit setting and there's chestnut setting on the trees. The other species that are in the fields, the cover crop, as well as that intensive regrowth that I was showing that we're doing the coppice on, that's doing really well. And the sign of it's getting the nutrients out of the soil that they need. We still have challenges in the soil, but there's definitely improvement. And we're looking towards the next number of years 5 through 10. We'll be continuing the practices. We'll be monitoring how the soil conditions improve. Definitely have information from other perennial cropping systems and chestnut orcharding areas, and it's pretty likely that that's the changes in the soil and improvements in the soil are going to happen over a slightly longer term than just the first few years. And so that's what we're looking forward to, and we'll be tracking over the next number of years. All right, so I'd like to thank you all for coming, and interested to hear from you if there's questions or thoughts that you have. Love to open it up from here and have some time for some discussion.
Thanks so much, Jono. It was great. We have 2 questions in the chat as it pertains to harvest. One of the people is wondering that, let me read the question for you. So they have an old chestnut tree about 25 feet tall. However, good harvest. However, the nuts explode out of the husks and the animals gather them basically before they can. They're looking for suggestions and any possible, or is it possible to harvest before the husks burst open? And then as a follow-up question, someone is looking at prolonging the freshness of the chestnuts because they're noticing that they've been molding quite quickly.
Oh yeah, good. All right, a couple areas that I really didn't get into. So so good, thank you. So the way that the nuts ripen is inside the burrs. You can see the green burrs on the picture on the right there. And the burrs, the nuts ripen, the burr splits open and the nuts fall out. There's sometimes when the nuts will stay in a burr, but that's pretty much how you know that they're ripe, when they've opened up. You can collect the burrs before they break open. You can bring them home. They're super spiny, that you need to be handled carefully and with gloves. And so you could go, it's another labor once they're up in the tree is to harvest the burrs before they've split open. But standard practice is to gather them up from the ground, either picking them by hand or getting what's called a nut wizard, which is a roller machine that you roll over the ground and they pop into the cage. And the way to beat the squirrels on that is to be there every day, sometimes harvesting twice a day. And you just have to beat the squirrels out of it, or share some with the squirrels. And it's a little bit of that's a challenge for sure. But in a lot of the commercial areas, they're just harvesting so regularly, and you just don't want nuts to be sitting on the ground for very long, because that relates to the second issue of the molding. But I'll also say that there are mechanical harvesters. There's some Italian machines, and generally considered to only be worth getting if you're into the 10 acres or more range of nuts. Very expensive equipment that are basically vacuums that are sweeping up everything and then separating out the materials from the nuts. And also won't work on steeper ground as well. So only work on flatter ground. So generally it's hand harvesting, though there are a lot of people experimenting with, nets and raking and different kinds of things that can be done to speed it up somewhat. As far as storage goes, the nuts, it's a high carbohydrate nut. It's primarily carbohydrate. There's very little protein and very little oil. And so once they ripen, they can immediately start spoiling if they're not refrigerated. So the standard practice is to get them into a refrigerator right away, immediately, and they should be refrigerated until they're processed or eaten fresh, or roasted and eaten fresh. And that's where you see them getting moldy, as if they've been sitting out. And that is something you'll see variability in grocery stores that are importing chestnuts from other places, and they don't necessarily realize that they need to be refrigerated. So if you're buying chestnuts and they've been sitting out in a display unrefrigerated, they're probably not that great. They've dried out, they're gotten hard. And that's one reason why a lot of people in the US don't like chestnuts, is because the chestnuts they've had are not very good. That's another thing that we're working on, is to show people how amazing they can be, and roasting them fresh. And so they need to be refrigerated, and then in that case they're going to be good for several months, and be in good condition.
Great. As a quick follow-up question, Catherine's wondering if one can mow low to the ground prior to nut ripening.
Yes, so that's something I didn't really get into. That is, you can see here the Queen Anne's lace in the picture there, and the lush verdant meadow growth that we've allowed. As these trees come into bearing more, they're definitely gonna need to be mowed underneath for access to the nuts, because you don't want to be having to go through this high herb layer and in the brush. They need to be pretty nicely mowed within the beginning of harvest. So the harvest is generally somewhere between mid-September and late October. And so we anticipate as the trees get larger, we would come in kind of mid to late summer and start to mow and open things up, and be ready so that as the nuts fall, they're right on the ground. You can see them and get them all up. And that's one way to keeping the predators down. And there are some pest issues. So if you get into production, there's a weevil, a chestnut weevil that can get into the nuts, and that has to be dealt with too, usually through a hot treatment, heating treatment in the nuts, and cleaning them up off the ground regularly.
Great. John is asking about the aerial predator protection that is used for the chickens.
Yeah. So Martin, who was running the chicken operation, he dealt with the aerial predators in a number of different ways. I will say one thing is that in our specific area, the aerial predators were much worse than the ground predators. And I think that's just because the valley that we're in is much more open. There's a lot less hiding areas for some of the ground predators. Several different methods that Martin tried included strings over the top, netting over the top, having the mobile shelters, and also having geese within the paddocks with the chickens. And I'm not sure any of them were the silver bullet or completely effective. The geese apparently were not great, but Martin's feeling was that maybe a different breed would be better. But the breed that he was using or having with the chickens, they had bonded to each other and were protective of each other and not necessarily the chickens. And I think that a lot of the other methods just depended on the labor it took in the rotational sequence of being able to move the netting along within these paddock areas. And so there was a percentage that got picked off, but it was not that high. And so it was an issue, but it didn't, there was no just large kind of losses.
Cool. We had another question regarding species and variety. Can you discuss species and variety of chestnuts becoming available, especially American chestnut hybrids?
Yeah, let's see. So I'm not going to talk about the American chestnuts. Basically, the way I frame it is that this is really, we're doing this as an agricultural operation, utilizing the blight-resistant Chinese and Chinese genetics. A lot of varieties, a lot of selection and breeding happening within that realm. American chestnut and restoration of the American chestnuts is a really great project, but it's very different. It's different genetics. It's a different tree. It's a tree that's going to be part of the forest in the Northeast. It's a much bigger tree. It needs to come back. I don't think we should be using genetically modified organisms, which is what they're doing right now and is about to be released in the next year or two. The Chinese and Chinese hybrids that are being selected for there's a lot of breeding. There's a lot of different plantings happening right now. I would recommend searching through for some different nurseries that you can get some great material depending where you are. If you're in our area of zone 5, even into 4, so sort of 4 through 6, you could be looking at Perfect Circle Farm in Vermont, Route 9 Collective, Twisted Tree. There's a number of nurseries in our region that have some really great material that are doing a lot of selection and breeding of some really good stock to utilize.
Yeah, that's awesome. And if you guys are wondering later on about that, we can either drop some links in the chat or you can contact Jono and ask him for those. We have an interesting question here, and I was kind of thinking about this too, as far as remediation goes, which it seems like this practice is definitely rooted in principles of restoration. Lenore asks, how well would this agroforestry approach work with local fruit orchards to make those farmers' businesses more financially viable and widen crop production like chickens, etc., as well as ecosystem regeneration? And may there be grants or subsidies to support that?
Oh yeah, great. Really great question. Yeah, what's exciting, I think, about the agroforestry patterns is that it's really adaptable, really flexible. It allows for some different combinations of crops. There's definitely people who are using fruit orchards with grazing. the Cars Cider House, which is not too far from us in Hadley, Mass. They have in their apples and pears and other fruit, sheep grazing underneath and rotational grazing of sheep. So you're getting this kind of diversification. You're getting both the benefits of the livestock on the ground, the manure, the using the forage, and you're getting a little bit of additional resilience to the farm operation, where you could, if it's a really bad year for the fruit, you've got some livestock happening. You've got some other avenues in case we have a challenging year, which is really kind of what's happening more and more. So I think it's pretty exciting from a farmer perspective of diversification. What we're experimenting with, I was alluding to, is having Martin come on, or having other farmers come on, having multiple farmers who can be doing kind of operations that have overlap and connection between them on the same piece of ground. And so we're pretty excited. We're looking to collaborate with some herb growers that could put herbs in some of the alleys, possibly some more kinds of small livestock, and have these overlapping kind of operations that work together and synergize together. And then you're getting multiple crops, and you're also supporting the wildlife along the edges and around the different patches within the farm. And so you're getting a lot of like the ecosystem benefits that are possible as well. So we're really excited about agroforestry and the possibilities of applying it to many, many different settings. We're down in the bottomland in a floodplain area, but it has a lot of possibilities for the higher, drier, rocky, poor soil and denuded soils of the uplands in the Northeast as well, where using tree crops and perennial crops can be part of regenerating soil, slowing water movement off of the ground, rooting deeply and sequestering carbon. So I think it has a lot of possibility. I haven't really even mentioned that the windbreak that we're establishing windbreak hedgerow on the north side of the property is primarily hazelnuts, which is another kind of up and coming perennial crop. There's been a lot of selection of hybrid hazelnuts, so they're not really the Americans, but they're also complex crosses. And so this kind of gets into the subsidies or grants, in that we have been working with NRCS. There is more and more interest from NRCS in these kind of regenerative agriculture practices in agroforestry and perennial crops. And they have given us some money to help establish the hedgerow on the north side, where we're planting a pretty diverse mixture, primarily hazelnuts, but it also has a Illinois everbearing mulberry and some hawthorns, and trialing some northern pecans and basket willow and a few other things. And partly it's for windbreak, and partly it's just for a diversified hedgerow, which is going to produce nuts and fruit and biomass. And they have given us a small amount of money to help establish that, and to learn about how that works with these kind of multiple different species. So that's a really good source, I think, for support and funding. NRCS, as well as there's some programs through MDAR, the state of Massachusetts, or organizations like CISA, organizations like NOFA. So I think that there's a lot of possibilities for getting some support in establishing these kinds of systems. And that's some of the work that we do at Regenerative Design Group. So we'll work with farmers. We might get funding from someone else, like we've worked with CISA, who might get a grant and then help pay us to go work with a farmer, a grower, and look at what suitable crops are, what kind of layout might work, what kind of develop an implementation plan, develop even yield estimates and some financial estimates to try and understand what the timeline is going to be, because some of these crops like chestnuts have a delay from planting to while you're waiting for them to bear and become commercially viable.
Wow, great. That's amazing. I actually had a question too. I was wondering about inputs, and kind of like I had mentioned earlier, there seems to be a lot of emphasis on this restoration principle here, where we're working with really compacted soils with not a lot of nutrient density, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm wondering, are you planning for or imagining a point at which it's like a very low input kind of closed loop system? And like maybe what do the inputs such as like the borax and seaweed or kelp, excuse me, and stuff like that? What's your plan? Is it going to be prolonged, or hopefully maybe at some point it will be closed loop enough where you got the soil kind of covered and it starts to do its own thing? Yeah,
I think it's a really good question. I think that, for us, it's really a short term, get the system back and in a better place. So sort of like the way a lot of land that has degraded, that has lost fertility, that it's lost soil, there's an input, or, I think of regenerative as giving back, as like, what do we have to put back? We have to give of ourselves, of the land. We have to try and rebuild what's been lost. And so, yes, they're definitely, the soil has what it needs, but it also might take decades to get back there. But we can help push that forward. I think the role of being regenerative farmers and land restorers is to be part of that giving back and rebuilding faster, in some cases as very fast if we can, because it can be more commercially viable. In some cases it could take a number of years, maybe even decades. So we anticipate, really just another few years of some inputs, of some more intensive management. And then really a lot of these crops that we're growing it's going to be just about harvesting, some management, some adding mulches and doing some compost applications over some years to recharge micronutrients. But otherwise, chestnuts will bear for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is really for the long term. If we are rebuilding soil for a decade and then that goes for several hundred years, it seems like a pretty good trade-off to me.
Thanks. Russ had mentioned earlier that he's heard of some native folks observing where the squirrels would carry nuts and then raid their caches and make sure to leave them something behind in gratitude.
Yes. Yeah, I know who people.
And then
some nurseries.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I know some nurseries who have worked just to do that. I'm not really sure. I think I'll stop sharing and we can see each other a little bit. Yeah, I'm not really sure if I've not heard of anybody doing that with chestnuts. I've know some nursery folks who have done that, and at a certain point, as we were selling chestnuts this fall, and just really just so excited and so charged about the nuts, and I think I would be hard for me to watch squirrels running away with them and hoping that we could get them back from them at some point. So it could be worth experimenting with, but I'd probably be more inclined to camp out in the field with my dogs and make sure that we got as many of the nuts as we could.
That's so funny. He's also wondering if you've ever eaten the chestnut weevil, because he found the hickory weevil to be quite tasty.
Oh, Well, I have to say, I'm sure that I've eaten more than a few weevils, but not that I could tell the flavor. Once you roast the chestnuts, you're not gonna taste weevil if they happen to be in there. But there is I haven't actually, Russ. We'll have to give that a try. We're gonna next fall when we are doing our roasting, our collecting and roasting, we'll do some trying of that if we can find a few of them.
Count me in. The floor is open if anybody, we have a couple of minutes left. If anybody wants to come off mute and ask a couple of questions.
Any other questions? Anybody have any stories of a favorite recipe of the way they've eaten chestnuts?
I have a question. Where would be a good source to acquire, for the initial orchard?
Yeah, so I named a few. I'll name them again, and somebody could type them into the chat if they want to. But so some of the orchards, some of the nurseries that are growing, and there's an increasing number, and there's also a young fellow, Jesse Markson, who's setting up a nursery near us. And you could search for that in the coming year. It'll be the name of his nursery is Yellow Bud Nursery, partly because he's also got a bitter nut, aka Yellow Bud Hickory oil press that he'll be getting some fresh oil from. And so another nursery is Perfect Circle Farm in Vermont, Twisted Tree in New York. Route 9 Collective is probably the premier source in the US for Chinese chestnut genetics. Been doing it probably the longest and has a very good selection of nuts. You can also go look at the HARC, H-A-R-C, which is the University of Missouri nursery, where they release varieties that after they've been trialing them. They'll often sell them to nurseries to grow out, but I think you can buy the nuts from them and then grow them out yourself. Yeah, so there's a handful there of some of the larger sources. There's quite a few others. Red Fern Farm in Iowa. I've bought from Burnt Ridge Nursery, who has Chinese, but he also has a lot of Europeans and Japanese that we can't necessarily grow ourselves. So keep your eyes out. Here's my plug though, is that people should plant like an apple tree. You should plant, if you're growing in an orchard and you're growing trees that you're going to care for over decades and really want to get the best harvest from, you should plant the best varieties that you can find. If you're doing a wildlife planting, some people plant for deer or for wildlife, then just collect some nuts from some chestnuts. You can still find them around, Chinese chestnuts that are planted in the last decades, and plant some that are good, but they might not be the most improved varieties. So in that case, you're just planting them because you're going to be feeding the wildlife. So go get the best trees that you can, because you're going to be planting trees that will be bearing for hundreds of years.
There's another question that came through in the chat. It says, are there any challenges working with extension on the soil monitoring?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to disparage anybody here. We don't work with extension. Extension's been primarily dismantled in our area. I would like to work with extension. I would like to interface more. Honestly, I'm not even sure who's at our local extension right now. Yeah, they're also completely, really not a lot of resources in extension around nut tree growing or perennial cropping, maybe some fruit growing, or fruit tree growing, or maybe some small fruit growing, but zero to no resources on nut tree production right now. Hopefully in the future, and as I mentioned, that UMass experiment in silvopasture, hopefully you'll get more interest and more involved.
I have a question. So, Jono, I'm sorry I arrived late, so you may have covered this in your talk, and I apologize if you did. So, have you grown chestnuts from seed, from the nuts themselves, and have the trees been around long enough to bear? And if so, how are the nuts compared to the parent nut?
Yeah, so I haven't done really any growing from nuts. I've been primarily buying seedlings. I didn't really cover this actually. I bought primarily seedlings. Occasionally I've gotten a few grafted trees, but not very many. And the idea there is to just have a lot more diversity within the seedlings. There is a lot of variability in seedlings and growing out nuts from trees, but with a pretty good true to form, a pretty good true to the genetics of the parent trees. So what I understand is that a lot of these nurseries, the better nurseries, are getting nuts from trees that are producing whatever characteristics they're looking for, whether early producing or larger nuts or better flavor, and that those traits are carried on in the nuts of the trees with some variability. So or a lot of nurseries are growing out, planting hundreds or thousands of nuts and then selecting out for vigor or other characteristics that they see within the nursery. So I'm not really doing that myself. I'm just buying seedlings or occasionally some grafted trees. I have a handful of grafted trees in my planting, and that's kind of what we're working with. So I do think it's okay to do some selection like that, and if you find some trees that are amazing, planting them out and growing them out. I do caution people though, because there are a lot of trees in our area, in this part of Western Massachusetts. There are a lot of trees planted in the 80s and early 90s that are good. They're good Chinese chestnuts, but they're not very good. They're not as good as they've gotten 4 decades later. There's a whole nother round of more improved trees that have been selected and are being grown. And so it's better to not select from those trees that were good 40 years ago, better to collect and grow out the most improved trees. So it's interesting. And then there's a whole nother discussion we won't really have time for about grafted trees, and there's some graft incompatibility issues and challenges with growing out grafted trees. But so mostly sticking with seedlings is safer. Yes, I see you have a question, Lenore.
Your last question there.
Oh, hi guys, thank you. This is not actually a farming question. This is more of an activist question. I love agroforestry. I love everything about it. And as an organizer, an environmental organizer and activist, I wonder if there's people in the region, in the Northeast, that are doing agroforestry that are speaking to policymakers on at least the state level about how to use that to inform how we address biodiversity and climate collapse. And if not, can we get a coalition of those people to inform the CECP and the plans that the state is putting together, very ill-informed plans that don't connect energy renewables with ecosystem regeneration, which is what we need to do. And agroforestry is such a beautiful example, elegant and practical long-term example of doing that in the field.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's you're spot on. And I would answer with a very qualified sort of. There's some of that activity happening. There's a lot more interest, just even in the last 5 to 10 years. I've really been digging into agroforestry of more interest at NRCS, where now there's some discussions happening, higher and higher up in the agency about the need to support agroforestry, different kinds of agroforestry. How can we get funding for farmers to implement and make transition or bring this into their practice? It's still really early. There's still a lot of, because the education systems are disintegrated to do integrated practices. You have foresters who don't want to see livestock in the forest, and you have pasture grazier people who don't want to see trees in the pasture. So you have this disintegration that we're really up against. But I think there's some good changes afoot. There are people talking. I would think I would call out specifically Megan Giroux of Interlace Commons and Interlace Agroforestry, who is doing a lot of education and policy work through her nonprofit, and her and ourselves at Regenerative Design Group and other people are doing a lot of technical support, trying to work with farmers. And in doing that, we are going to NRCS and MDAR and other organizations and trying to find if, where can there be funding, where can there be policy changes that can help make this happen? So it's a really great question, and there's more talk happening. One thing that happened is that there was a grant put out by a national organization to fund agroforestry in the U.S. And it was a significant amount of money, and there was just an explosion of everybody who was doing any kind of agroforestry started talking together and combining into groups and coming up with projects to submit for this funding, which, though there wasn't a lot of projects, they actually only ended up funding four organizations. But it got a lot of discussion happening. It got a lot of network building, got a lot of excitement. And we think it's sort of spurred some within the region here, a lot of sort of coalition building and network building and discussion about what is the organization we need to go and be at some of these tables and start to advocate for these practices. And I think that's what you're talking about, is we're at a place where we really need that. This is a tool. Agroforestry is a tool that could be a solution on so many different levels. And it's just a hard, there's a hard leap to get over for most farmers and landowners in the implementation. So I think you're spot on, and that's where things need to be going.
Megan who?
Megan Giroux, Giroux, Interlace Agroforestry. I'll write that down.
That's a great way to wrap this up. I love that application, Lenore. So thanks for asking that question. So yeah, we're gonna wrap it up. Jono, that was super informative, and I'm so glad you were able to share all of that with us today. Paul has been able to drop a bunch of links in the chat for us. One is for the evaluation. It's a great time to give us some feedback about this session, so feel free to go ahead and click that link. We also have our vendor marketplace, remember that. Again, you can find some generous discount codes and valuable information from our vendors. We also have our auction, incredible items to bid on, like access to the Soil Food Web School's foundation courses, a pallet of organic soil delivered from the coast of Maine, all sorts of stuff. And it actually helps to support our year-round programming and advocacy work. So it's a win-win for everyone. And then we also have some more sessions tomorrow from 11 o'clock to 5:30 on Sunday. They're all listed in the program book, and additionally, recordings of the sessions will be available to you all via YouTube by Monday, the 24th of January. And you'll also find all of Jono's information there if you want to get in touch. So please make sure to grab the links that we've dropped for you. And Jono, again, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending this workshop.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Good night, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.